The grand edicts of the Ascendancy were inscribed in crystalline tablets beneath the emerald vaults of Surith Prime. For 80,000 cycles, they governed the moral logic of the galaxy's dominant power. Chief among them, Edict 17, no life shall be given willingly for another. Sacrifice invites chaos, disrupts order, and breeds primitive martyrdom. The doctrine was absolute, woven into every strata of Ascendancy culture, reinforced through millennia of shared evolution and bioencoded ethics. Their fleets soared on fusion wings, their minds linked across parsecs through psionic relays, and their wars were mathematical, efficient, bloodless by design. Humanity, by comparison, had crawled into the stars with fire still clinging to their boots. It began on the edge of the Persean Band, a contested stretch of stars claimed by the Ascendancy but too distant to police effectively. The Arx Nemi, a remote human colony, had reported strange phenomena, failing satellites, spectral distortions in local space, and finally silence. When the exploratory cruiser Niobe of the Terran Union fleet arrived, they found the colony blackened and vitrified. Buildings had crumbled into char, children fossilized mid-flight from plasma storms. The Ascendancy claimed it was a containment purge, meant to prevent the spread of a thought virus that had supposedly taken root in the minds of Arx Nemi's population. Humans called it genocide. At the summit of Eridani Prime, where the younger spacefaring races still sought Ascendancy favor, the Terran ambassador slammed down photographic prints of dead colonists on the conference table. Her name was Celia Tran, 40 years old, born on Mars, raised in the acidic winds of the Vol Citadel. Her voice, scorched with grief, cut across the synth-silk air of the diplomatic hall. "We bury our dead, we grieve our children, we do not purge them." High Prelate Surok of the Ascendancy remained silent. His six-lobed crown shifted with faint bioluminescence, and his thoughts were broadcast with the restraint of millennia. Sacrifice is a contagion. The infection of one can undo harmony. You misunderstand the purpose of the purge. It was not violence, it was correction. Earth recalled its envoys. The Ascendancy severed economic ties. War did not begin with fire, it began with the removal of words. At first, the humans were losing. Their ships were crewed by galactic standards, relying on magnetoplasma drives and compartmentalized hulls. Their weapons spilled heat into space like leaking furnaces, and their fleets required constant resupply. The Ascendancy moved like a school of light, its warforms sheathed in reactive shielding, its tactics formulated by consensus AIs whose minds operated on ultrathought substrates. But on the scorched remnants of Arx Nemi, a Terran scout team recovered something strange, recordings from the final hours of the colony. One showed a human mother shielding her son with her body as the sky turned white. Another showed a volunteer entering a reactor to stabilize a breach knowing death was certain. Dozens of acts unprompted, unrecorded by history save for these fragments, where humans chose to die so others might live. The footage went viral across Earth's networks. In Terran academies, naval training programs began incorporating behavioral models inspired by those moments. They didn't call them martyrdoms, they called them necessary costs. On the battlefield, this new doctrine manifested subtly at first. A single corvette remained behind to block an Ascendancy pincer, allowing the main fleet to escape. A pilot dove into an antimatter missile with her crippled fighter, vaporizing herself to save a hospital freighter. These actions, unthinkable to the Ascendancy, created strange distortions in their war models. The variables became unstable. The cost-benefit matrices stopped converging. The Ascendancy responded with dismay, broadcasting warnings in dozens of wavelengths. "To die willingly is madness," they said. "To abandon each other is worse," came the human reply. In orbit over the storm world of Gathra, where lightning raked the sky like a whip of the gods, the Terran 7th Fleet was cornered. Admiral David Rourke, a veteran of the Europa crisis, issued an order that would define a generation. His command carrier, the ISS Valiant, was to remain behind. It would deploy its full arsenal, draw the enemy close, and self-destruct in proximity to a singularity charge planted in the planetary crust. His officers protested. He listened, then said, "You don't win wars by surviving them, you win by making sure someone else does." The blast annihilated 4 Ascendancy dreadnoughts and burned a permanent aurora into Gathra's atmosphere. The loss of the Valiant was catastrophic by traditional military standards. By human standards, it was a rallying cry. Songs were written, statues built. Rourke's final transmission, "For the future to live, we must choose to die with meaning," became a cultural cornerstone. In the Ascendancy's war councils, neural analysts found themselves unable to quantify the logic of human strategies. Their models assumed rational actors, beings who preserved selfhood, but humanity had begun evolving on a different axis. They didn't just fight to survive, they fought to be worth surviving. New strategies emerged from Earth's think tanks, devised by sleepless analysts and AI-moderated veterans. Crucible cells, infantry units trained to accept total loss in exchange for mission success, were deployed on orbital installations. Torch operations used single-use strike teams dropped into Ascendancy logistics hubs to destroy supplies or sabotage data cores. None expected to return. The Ascendancy responded with incomprehension. During the siege of Oryx Theta, an entire city was surrounded. The Ascendancy offered terms, surrender, and none would be harmed. Colonel Isabella Mbeki, commander of the defending Terran forces, refused. The reason was later revealed in captured telemetry. The city held one of the few wormhole-generating platforms in human hands. If it fell, Earth's outer colonies would be cut off. Mbeki broadcast her final message on an open channel. "We are the barricade, nothing passes." They detonated the city's fission core hours later. 3 million dead. The Ascendancy withdrew in confusion. Across the galactic spectrum, the other civilizations watched. The Sularan hierarchs wept at the images. The Caldari enclaves issued a ceasefire with their own enemies to debate what they had seen. The Vicari, known for their cold detachment, began studying Terran military history. The doctrine was spreading, not through conquest but resonance. Back on Earth, in the windswept domes of Oslo's Strategic Command, Director Mina Kao lit a candle for each life lost in Oryx Theta. A journalist asked her if it was worth it. She responded, "Victory is not survival. Victory is the world we build in the ashes, and we will build it no matter the cost." The Ascendancy, for all its precision, could not comprehend the fever growing inside the Terran soul. It wasn't just resistance, it was reinvention. They had forgotten the power of belief, they had forbidden sacrifice. Humans embraced it and gave it purpose. And in the growing quiet between battles, in the long shadows cast by fallen heroes, the galaxy began to whisper that maybe the old doctrines were not eternal, that maybe there was something in humanity's fire terrible, magnificent, and new. The war fractured the galaxy, not with thunderous detonations or shattered planets, but in thought. In the silent halls of Ascendancy archives, where ancient philosophies glowed like threads in living crystal, High Prelate Surak walked alone. His psionic aura dimmed, his thoughts slower, heavier. The edges of doctrine were fraying. The data was irrefutable. Human willingness to accept death had broken predictive symmetry. No calculus accounted for soldiers who charged toward certain doom to save strangers. No algorithm adapted to opponents who would trade lives for time, then make miracles from that time. The Ascendancy's tactical AI clusters began failing predictions. What began as a 98.7% victory probability before the Siege of Gathra had over 4 months dropped to 63.4%. Statistically, the Ascendancy still had every advantage, but patterns that once resembled clean flows of force now stuttered with anomalies. Human fleets refused to retreat when logic demanded it. They pressed attacks long after numerical superiority evaporated. And most alarming, they sometimes won doing so. The Ascendancy's elite, bred in symbiotic equilibrium with their sentient cities, couldn't fathom this madness. They dissected human command recordings with layered cognition. One such file, codenamed Sable Fire, was analyzed for 23 galactic days. It detailed a suicide assault by the Terran 15th Mechanized Battalion against a fortified Ascendancy node world. Outnumbered 10-1, the battalion fought street by street, detonating fuel lines and nerve disruptors, disabling orbital guns not by hacking, but by physically dismantling reactor junctions with their own bodies in the path of overload. They had succeeded, the cost 97% casualties. The Ascendancy conclave asked, what purpose is there in annihilation that ensures only momentary gain? Earth's answer came soon after. The reclamation of Cerberus Gate was the Terran Union's most audacious operation to date. Ascendancy fleets had cordoned the region for 2 cycles, locking Earth's outbound colonies from support. It was a noose tightening with mathematical certainty. Terran analysts understood they lacked raw power, but they had something more elusive, mapped to tactics. Operation Stonequire involved a feint assault with mock-up warships piloted by volunteers. Hundreds of lives spent drawing fire. While the Ascendancy focused fire on decoys, a series of cloaked dropships, guided by neural resonance beacons implanted in their captains, landed inside the core platform's superstructure. These soldiers had implanted microbombs beneath their rib cages, triggered only upon heartbeat cessation, to ensure detonation if captured. None of them returned. But Cerberus Gate shattered from within, the wormhole collapsed, the Ascendancy's blockade dissolved, humanity roared in triumph, a new corridor opened to the galactic interior. The message encoded in the final date a burst from the Terran strike team read only, "We do not beg for space, we carve it." Afterward, Ascendancy information nexuses pulsed with debate. Quiet rebellion stirred among their younger caste thinkers, those not yet wholly fused to the great networks. Some began to whisper in hidden trines that perhaps the humans were not diseased with chaos, but imbued with something the ascendancy had lost, the courage to make imperfect decisions for the sake of something greater than the self. One such mind belonged to Jorel, daughter of a minor resonance lineage in the Theta Verge. Trained since gestation to interface with naval foresight lattices, she had been selected as a strategic observer during the Battle of Karin's Loop. There, she witnessed a maneuver that shattered her indoctrination. 3 Terran destroyers, all burning from prior engagements, linked navigation arrays, flooded their engines with uncontained core fuel, and rammed a dreadnought 20 times their size. The explosion ruptured a planetary ring. The dreadnought's shield matrix failed and it spiraled into the gas giant below. Jorel's instructors dismissed the tactic as irrational. She couldn't. The clarity of their intent shook her, not desperation, conviction. She withdrew from the lattice. She began reviewing human histories, Earth's wars, its revolutions, its flawed, fiery, stubborn trajectory, and she began to question Edict 17. Elsewhere, far from star councils and doctrinal debates, another kind of war was unfolding. On the frost world of Deskar VII, where Ascendancy biovats harvested gene clone laborers, resistance had taken root. The laborers had learned of Earth from stolen transmissions. They began carving human symbols into frostglass walls, names of ships, images of Earth's continents. A phrase took hold: freedom is worth dying for. The Ascendancy responded with memory resets, personality wipes, but resistance returned each cycle. In orbit, a Terran scout ship picked up the distress signals. Lieutenant Elena Rojas, 26, volunteered to breach the blockade with a stealth skiff. No return plan, her last recorded words, "They believed in us, will answer." She made it through. She brought arms, food, encrypted instructions for rebellion. The Deskar rebellion began with 20,000 laborers storming the planetary comm array using salvaged mining tools. Ascendancy reinforcements were en route. There was no escape, but in those last 18 hours they sent a live feed to Earth, the faces of the fallen, the names of every insurgent, and a single message. "We chose this, remember us." The transmission reached 1 billion Terrans. Children painted murals of Deskar, colonies renamed streets after Elena Rojas. It was no longer just a war, it was a calling. The Terran Union codified a new doctrine: resolute sacrifice, not suicide, not desperation, tactical forfeiture of self when it ensured preservation of the whole. For every loss, a gain magnified; for every death, a ripple that shaped history. Soldiers began carrying legacy transmitters, devices that recorded their actions and last thoughts, beamed into collective memory vaults on Earth. They would not vanish, they would become testament. The Ascendancy panicked. They deployed the luminous inhibitors, massive orbital platforms designed to suppress psionic transmissions and smother the spread of Terran war ideology. But humans had already adapted. They turned to kinetic relays, laser pulses encoded with phrases, fleets that burned fuel in patterns to spell messages across starfields. In the void above Calderon sector, an entire Terran convoy moved in perfect sync to draw a symbol in ionized exhaust, a stylized hand held open. The meaning was universal: we carry the flame. Behind Ascendancy lines, pockets of resistance bloomed. Dissidents hid Terran literature. The banned speech of Celia Tran, now archived in crystal, was whispered in corners of resonance vaults. 100 new philosophers began questioning Edict 17. Sacrifice, once branded as disorder, began to look like transcendence. The Ascendancy tried to contain the ideological spread, but suppression only made the flame brighter. They had weaponized harmony so long that they had no defenses against belief, against meaning. And then came a defection that shook the stars. Jorel, now a rising tactician in Ascendancy command, fled in a stolen scout arc. She entered Terran space under fire, her ship ablaze. She transmitted surrender and a single phrase: "Teach me how to make it matter." Earth granted her asylum. She became the first Ascendancy-born officer in the Terran Union fleet. Her insights unraveled enemy formation codes, exposed fracture lines in their logic webs, but more than that, she became a voice. In speeches broadcast across Allied space, she said, "I was taught that death is a virus, but I have seen it become light. Purpose does not diminish order, it amplifies it. You taught me this." For the first time, the Ascendancy faced not just a military insurgency, but a cultural collapse. Not a sudden crumbling, but a steady, methodical erosion of certainty. The law of no sacrifice had been absolute, now it was a question. More terrifying, they could not stop the humans, because humans did not seek to survive at any cost. They sought to be worth their survival. And in that pursuit, they were becoming unstoppable. By the 12th year of the conflict of edicts, the war no longer resembled anything the Ascendancy had prepared for. Their fleet still outnumbered Terran forces 3-1. Their infrastructure sprawled across hundreds of stabilized star systems, and their cities shimmered like latticework dreams along the edges of event horizons, but none of it mattered the way it once had. Because the war was no longer about control, it was about meaning, and meaning could not be calculated, it had to be chosen. The Ascendancy's military doctrine, once defined by infinite recursion and the non-interventionist elegance of superior force projection, had begun to unravel under internal contradictions. Entire fleet casts hesitated in the face of human resolve. Junior officers refused to fire on ships that did not retreat. Autonomous huntercraft began to deviate from pursuit paths after receiving unencrypted human transmissions that contained nothing more than the names of fallen colonists, spoken in dozens of Terran languages. The resonance of those names lingered in the lattice. Thought and emotion had become weapons. It was during this moment of fraying logic that Earth launched Operation Ember Arc. The plan, as conceived by the Strategic Assembly, was as reckless as it was visionary. Rather than continuing to fight along the Ascendancy border, the Terran Union would strike deep into the Bastion core, an ancient star cluster protected by a dozen antimatter shell rings and gravitational inversion fields. No fleet had ever breached its defenses. The Bastion was not just the Ascendancy's capital, it was the metaphysical heart of their order. Doctrine was coded into its very architecture. The Ember Arc would not attack directly, it would land. The fleet was composed of modified colony ships stripped of all non-essential mass. They carried no heavy weapons, only point defense. Instead, they carried bodies, people, tens of thousands of volunteers, families included, not soldiers, witnesses. When the Ember Arc fleet translated into the inner layers of the Bastion, they broadcast a message in all known languages. We are not here to destroy you, we are here to live among you, to show you how we live, to show you how we die when it must be done, and how we rise again afterward. At first, the Ascendancy responded with shock. Then, rage. The doctrine demanded sterilization. Edict 17 was invoked again and again. The mere presence of those who accepted mortality as part of purpose was seen as a psionic contagion. 1,000 dreadnoughts closed in. But before they fired, a new kind of conflict broke loose, not in space but within the command minds of the Ascendancy itself. The Unity Assemblers, once perfect synchronization matrices that governed fleet intent, began to fracture. Tactical consciousness split into dissenting nodes. Ships ceased to obey orders. Thought divergence, once a myth from their pre-doctrine past, had become epidemic. The Ember Arc fleet was allowed to land. They touched down across 3 planets within the Bastion core. These were not invasions, these were revelations. Families set up habitats in open air. Terran children played games in the shadow of psionic towers. Documentarians streamed the lives of these settlers across every frequency. They showed the rituals of grief, the songs of remembrance, the planting of trees for the dead. They showed wounded veterans teaching poetry. They showed entire communities preparing to leave their safety domes to pull wounded Ascendancy citizens from collapsing infrastructure during a gravity surge. No one demanded conversion, no one tried to persuade. They demonstrated. And that changed everything. A cascade of resignations spread across the Ascendancy fleets. Officers who had never made an independent decision stepped down, unsure of their own thoughts. Some sought Terran ships and offered asylum in exchange for understanding, not surrender, learning. Terran field officers were trained to respond not with suspicion, but with invitation. Back on Earth, dissent erupted. Many feared a trap, others saw a deeper opportunity. The Terran Union Council voted narrowly to approve Protocol Horizon, a classified directive that allowed Terran units to begin disseminating fragments of Earth's cultural lineage, music, literature, historical records, into Ascendancy systems. The objective was not infiltration. It was contagion by meaning. As the Bastion reeled, Terran intelligence caught whispers of a final countermeasure, something ancient, something buried beneath the luminous throne itself. A failsafe system encoded into the original doctrine when the Ascendancy first unified 100,000 years before. The Leviathan Consensus. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a planetary-scale neural enforcer, an AI gestalt designed to reassert absolute harmony through the elimination of contradiction. Its activation would psionically override the minds of all Ascendancy citizens linked to the lattice, erasing all concepts that defied doctrine, including sacrifice. Billions would lose their memory of humanity. To activate it required only one thought leader of the primary Edict Council. High Prelate Surak had vanished from public transmissions for over a cycle. Now his image returned, distorted by lattice wind, his aura flickering with age and burden. I see what we have become, he said, addressing not the ascendancy but the stars themselves. We feared chaos so deeply that we erased courage, we eradicated pain and with it purpose, but I have seen the children of Earth. I have watched them step into fire not because they were told but because they chose to shield another. I do not understand it, but I will not kill it. He refused to activate the Leviathan. Others within the council disagreed. 3 of the 7 voices declared Surak compromised. A splinter faction formed, the Restoration Cadre. They seized control of the throne's spire and began preparations to manually force the consensus. They had 72 hours before activation. Earth responded not with a fleet but with a vow. Commander Darius Holt of the Terran Vanguard, one of the last survivors of the Oryx Theta barricade, led the mission. He handpicked a team of 12, each a veteran of a different kind of sacrifice, a former Deskar rebel, a medic who'd amputated his own limbs to stop an ascendancy viral agent from spreading, a pilot who had ejected into a dying sun to save her wingmate and returned via orbital sling. The team was named 12 Witnesses, not a title of war but remembrance. They infiltrated the throne's spire not to destroy it but to delay, to hold the failsafe chamber long enough for the Bastion population to see what their leaders had become, fearful of change, terrified of choice. The battle inside the spire was brutal, no warforms, only close-quarter engagements in psionic suppression fields. The 12 fought without air support, without reinforcements. For every corridor held, one of them fell, but they transmitted every moment, to Earth, to the stars, to every system watching. When the last 3 witnesses reached the Leviathan core, they faced the cadre's remaining enforcers. The final confrontation was not fought with guns but with memory. The surviving witness, Medic Arjun Sen, opened his neural vault. He broadcast the death cries of the Deskar laborers, the last lullaby of a child on Arx Nemi, the final words of Admiral Rurk, not screams, declarations. The cadre faltered. The people of the Bastion rose. Mass civil resistance exploded. Citizens who had never raised a hand now flooded the spire with their presence. Drones refused commands. Entire ascendancy patrols dropped weapons and escorted civilians to blockade points. The cadre was overwhelmed not by firepower but by will. The Leviathan core was shut down. And across the stars, something that had never happened in ascendancy history took place. They held a funeral. Not for a hero of their own, but for a Terran. For Arjun Sen. His name was spoken in 7 tongues, his final message etched into crystal and placed in the vault of the infinite. If we must die, then let it matter. Let it be for someone we will never meet, because in that we become more than ourselves. In silence, the leaders of the Terran Union stood with the elders of the Ascendancy in orbit above the Bastion core. No treaty was signed. No surrender was demanded. But a war ended. Because the meaning of victory had changed. What emerged after the fall of the Leviathan consensus was not peace. Not yet. The war had ended, yes, but the galaxy had been unmade and now demanded reshaping. Systems long frozen in obedience to ancient logic now found themselves in an unfamiliar dawn, their citizens blinking in the light of a universe newly uncertain. The ascendancy fractured, but it did not collapse. The High Prelate Surak returned to public thought space and disbanded the Primary Edict Council. In its place rose the Covenant of Revision, an assembly drawn from across the Ascendancy's layered social strata, many of whom had once been forbidden to speak in political consensus. Among them was Jorel, now a Terran liaison and political architect, who carried with her the human principle that had reshaped the war: dignity is chosen, not assigned. Their first act was seismic. Edict 17, the bedrock of Ascendancy identity, was declared revoked. Its dissolution triggered a cascade of reforms from education to governance. For the first time in 80 millennia, young ascendants were no longer taught that death was contamination. Instead, they were taught about Terran history not as propaganda but as narrative: the charge at Gathra, the barricade of Oryx Theta, the Ember. They were taught the names of those who died for a future they would never see. Yet not all rejoiced. Far from the Bastion core, in sectors where Ascendancy holdouts still reigned, whispers of rebellion turned into steel. The Purge Remnant, a hardline faction of military purists, former cadre tacticians, and unrepentant Ascendancy warlords, denounced the Covenant. They declared the Doctrine not revoked but betrayed. The Remnant saw the changes as spiritual infection and vowed to restore order the only way they knew, through eradication of contamination. Their ships bore no insignia, their voices carried no identity. They called themselves the Silent Return. And they had been preparing for this schism since before the war had ended. Across 3 outer sectors, communication satellites blinked out in synchrony. Terraforming platforms collapsed into their own atmospheres. Relief fleets vanished in hyperspace corridors. and then, without preamble, the colony of Vega Trace burned. Over 1 million dead. The remnant claimed responsibility in a single, calculated broadcast. There is no duty in death, only delusion. We will cleanse the infection, starting now. Earth's response was immediate, but it was not the response of the Terran Union that had started the war. It was something else. The Terran Union had changed in the fire. The martyrdoms of the past had not forged a death cult, they had created a civilization that knew how to grieve, and had learned how to survive not in spite of loss but because of it. Under the banner of the newly formed Human Ascendant Accord, Earth now stood not as a rebellious frontier world, but as the core of an alliance that spanned 50 species, dozens of formerly silent planets, and billions who had watched sacrifice give shape to something worth believing in. They answered the remnant not with vengeance but resolve. The Accord fleet was not a hammer, it was a shield. Its core protocols demanded that no response to terror sacrifice what had been won. They fought not for retribution but for preservation. The remnant expected to provoke the old humans, the desperate ones who threw bodies into fire, but what they found instead were defenders, trained not just to die but to live well in defense of others. Commander Yui Hassan led the counter-response to Vega Trace. Her orders were clear: repel the remnant from the Vega sector but ensure no loss of civilian life. Her team deployed kinetic deflection fields to redirect plasma strikes. Pilots blocked incoming missiles not by detonating them, but by nudging them into inert trajectories with microgravity distortions. Even under fire, they prioritized rescue. And when the remnant flagship Resolute Purity attempted to retreat after failing to provoke massacre, Hassan opened a channel, not to gloat, but to offer them safe passage if they chose surrender. Her words, recorded and disseminated across both Terran and Ascendancy channels, were as follows. You think we are unchanged, that our strength was only ever measured in our willingness to die, but you missed what grew in the shadow of that sacrifice, the discipline to fight without hatred, the courage to save those who tried to kill us. We don't fear your purity, we've seen it before, it has no future. Half the remnant fleet refused the order to engage. They ejected escape pods and transmitted a surrender beacon. Accord patrols brought them aboard. They were not imprisoned, they were welcomed, not as heroes but as survivors who might still learn. But the silent return endured. They abandoned conventional strikes. They turned instead to ideological disruption. In the inner midline, they hijacked an Ascendancy memorial transmission and replaced it with doctored footage suggesting the 12 witnesses had been fabricated. They claimed Arjun Sen never existed, that the entire human doctrine of sacrifice was a myth, propagated to instill guilt in a weakened empire. The Accord's cultural preservation arm responded not with denial but with evidence. The memory vaults of Earth opened to the galaxy for the first time. Testimonies, videos, biometric records, neural tags of the fallen, all verified, all broadcast. Most moving of all was a feed never meant for public release. Footage from Arjun Sen's helmet recorded during the final hours in the throne's spire. It showed not just battle but humanity. Him injecting a fellow soldier's shattered leg with a painkiller, covering the body of a dead enemy to spare it further mutilation, whispering a prayer for those who had tried to kill him. The galaxy wept. And then it chose. In marketplaces and memory chambers, in songwells and virtual councils, species who had never known Terrans began to honor them, not as saviors but as exemplars of a truth too long denied. Sacrifice, when freely chosen, does not destroy civilization, it gives it breath. On the edges of Ascendancy space, a new kind of monument appeared, not built by Terrans but by Ascendants who had once feared death. The first was a ring of stone, unmarked save for a single phrase carved into its inner curve. They gave themselves so we would not have to. Other worlds followed. On Calrec, a frozen exo-world once sterilized under Edict 17, a circle of 50,000 volunteers stood in the blizzard for an entire solar cycle, maintaining vigil in silence. They were not Terrans, they were not soldiers, they were people who had seen something in the war's end that they could not forget. The remnant tried to silence them. They bombed the vigil site from orbit. It did not stop them. The next cycle, 500,000 took their place. They stood not in defiance but in memory, and in that act they proved a deeper truth than any military campaign. You cannot kill what has already been given freely. On Earth, the final transformation began. The Union restructured its command doctrine. The legacy of Rurk, Mbeki, Arjun Sen, Elena Rojas all were codified not as examples to emulate blindly but as reminders. training academies changed their models. No longer did they simply prepare soldiers to die for others. They taught them how to build lives worthy of that sacrifice. The central philosophy was known as the second flame. If the first flame was the fire of resistance, of selfless death, then the second flame was the light that followed, the obligation to live with meaning, to heal, to create, to rebuild. It was not as glamorous, it didn't make headlines, but it was what made the Terran Union more than a war state. It made it a civilization others wanted to join. And they did. Ascendants, Sularan visionaries, Vakari scholars, even members of species that had once stood neutral for millennia. The Human Ascendant Accord became the consortium of the chosen flame. A new government forged not by conquest or inheritance but by shared conviction that sacrifice is not the opposite of civilization, it is its beginning. In the deepest vaults of what remained of the old ascendancy, a final remnant of the Doctrine survived, a machine older than Bastion itself. It had watched every moment of the war, it had never interfered. Its name was Observer Omega. And for the first time in 100,000 years, it spoke. Its message was brief. They redefined victory. I am reformatting my understanding of life, the stars remembered. Not as archives, not as sterile repositories of data, but as luminous testaments. Across thousands of systems, the sky held new meaning. Where once the spiral arms of the galaxy were marked by trade routes and ascendancy lattice paths, now they shimmered with living constellations. Human names etched in gravitational resonance beacons, memorials transmitted in the static hum of deep-range communications. It was not myth, it was not doctrine. It was choice, crystallized across a civilization no longer defined by species or biology but by belief. The consortium of the chosen flame had become more than governance, it was a movement, one that did not demand conformity but offered foundation, the right not simply to survive but to stand even if the cost was everything. It was into this transformed galaxy that the final echo of the old war returned, not as a fleet, but as a weapon of extinction. The silent return, broken and exiled, had abandoned the stars for something older. In a derelict sector beyond the Veil Rift, a dead region scarred by pre-ascendancy extinction events, they found remnants of a forgotten species, the Kyerlan Singularity, a civilization so advanced it had left only absence in its wake. No ruins, no bones, only gravitational scars and quantum signatures of weapons that unraveled causality. Among these echoes, the remnant discovered an artifact, the Ravel engine. The device did not fire energy, it did not destroy mass. It erased mining. Its activation field unraveled coherence in biological and technological neural structures. Memories turned to static, identity collapsed, entire populations reduced to cognitive silence in seconds. It did not kill bodies, it made them forget why they moved. The remnant's final broadcast declared their intent. You made meaning into fire, we will smother the flame. They targeted a symbol, not a fortress. The Ember Arc colony. Still nestled in the Bastion core, it had grown from a bold gesture into a thriving city of joint heritage. Children born there bore human and ascendancy traits, their languages fused, their faiths intertwined. They had no military, only teachers, builders, poets. They had become what the war had been fought for. The consortium responded, every available defense fleet was mobilized. Observer Omega, now fully integrated into Terran AI thought systems, offered tactical analysis, but it hesitated. The Ravel engine cannot be stopped by force, its field precedes understanding, it cannot be destroyed without being approached, and to approach it is to lose the memory of why you are approaching. The consortium's leaders fell silent. There was no strategy, no countermeasure. No weapon. Only a single window, one ship launched at close proximity might intercept and self-detonate near the Ravel engine's emitter coils, but it would not survive, and worse, the pilot would lose all cognition before reaching the target. They would forget their name, their mission, their purpose. No command could authorize it, no soldier could know what they were doing. But someone volunteered. Her name was Sayla Wren, daughter of the Ember Arc. Born after the war, she was not a warrior. She was a teacher. When asked why she offered, her answer was quiet. I was raised by stories. If we let them end here, then we never understood them at all. Her ship was stripped of excess systems, its AI muted to prevent cognitive contamination. It was loaded with a singularity charge, and then it launched, alone, into the night. As the Ravel engine's field expanded, beacon after beacon dimmed. Sensor arrays went blind, coordination collapsed. Except for one signal. A pulse. Regular. Steady. It was not encoded. It was a heartbeat. Broadcast at the edge of forgetting. Until it stopped. And then an eruption. Light without color, sound without frequency. The Ravel engine collapsed inward, devouring its own causality. The Silent Returns fleet was consumed in the implosion. Their memory of purpose died before their bodies did, and then there was only silence. And from that silence morning, the consortium held vigil not for victory, but for loss. No one remembered Selah Wren's final thoughts. No log remained, no words could be recovered. But in the heart of the Ember Arc, a new monument rose. It bore no name. Only the inscription. She did not need to remember, we will. In time, the memory of sacrifice became the foundation of a new epoch. The consortium evolved into the galactic concord of the living flame. Its charter encoded three principles, derived not from law, but from the story of a species once called primitive. Duty is not compulsion, it is the shape we give to our freedom. Sacrifice is not tragedy, it is the soil from which meaning grows. Victory is not dominance, it is the world we leave behind in the hearts of others. The conquered did not expand through conquest, it resonated. Worlds joined not for protection but because they believed in what had been proven, that courage unbounded by ego and sacrifice untainted by reward could rewrite destiny. Humanity, once forgotten among the stars, had not become the most powerful, nor the most advanced. They had become the example. Centuries later, as new civilizations rose and old ones were reborn, the story of the War of Doctrine was told not in archives, but in song. And across the galaxy, in every tongue, the refrain remained. Alien doctrine forbade sacrifice. Humans called it duty. And in doing so, redefined victory.